Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Sanctions, What Everyone Needs to Know, by Bruce W. Jentleson, narrated by Peter Lerman. Introduction. Puzzles posed for international relations theory and foreign policy strategy. As I was finishing this book in early 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Sanctions were a major part of the U.S.-led counter-strategy. As Chapter 5 discusses and the appendix delineates, they were, by many measures, the most extensive sanctions ever imposed. They received broad global support. Major multinational companies that typically resist sanctions initiated their own. International sports organizations like FIFA and the Paralympics joined in. So too did cultural organizations. While not the overwhelming impact Biden administration officials originally touted, the Russian economy was hit hard. Whether or not these costs helped coerce Russia to end the war remained, as of this writing, early May 2022, to be seen. At the same time the Russia-Ukraine case was going on, debate raged over the sanctions against now Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Should the sanctions be lifted or at least reduced so as to provide relief to the Afghan people? Or would that teach the Taliban the wrong lesson, that they can rule as brutally as they want and still get international support? And what about Burma, also known as Myanmar? How could sanctions not be imposed given the military's brutal coup? Yet the military and other power brokers insulated themselves while the Burmese people were feeling the pain. Tough questions, and plenty of other cases posing their own versions. Indeed, for a number of years it's been hard to browse the news without seeing reports of yet another set of sanctions. The United States, U.S., currently also has sanctions against Iran, Venezuela, Russia, North Korea, China, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Mali, Central African Republic, Burma, Sudan, Nicaragua, Cuba, and a number of other countries. It has sweeping human rights legislation authorizing sanctions against offenders in any country. It sanctions thousands of specially designated individuals and companies, including drug traffickers, terrorist organizations, and individuals in positions of economic and political power. European Union, EU sanctions, while not as long a list, include many of the same countries and individuals as the U.S. list, plus some others. So too the British one, and the Canadian one. The United Nations, UN, which only imposed sanctions 4 times in its first 2 decades, 1945 to 1965, has done so over 40 times since then. Russia has repeatedly imposed sanctions against former Soviet republics, as well as retaliatory ones against the U.S. and the EU. China has been developing its own approach, with some sanctions targeted against other countries, for example, Norway, for awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to dissident Liu Xiaobo, South Korea for deploying a THAAD missile defense system, and others cued to Chinese social media against companies such as the Swedish retail giant H&M for refusing to buy cotton from the Xinjiang region because of atrocities against the Uyghurs, and organizations like the National Basketball Association, NBA, for tweeting in sympathy with the summer 2019 Hong Kong protests. And not just by major powers. Japan and South Korea sanctioned each other over historical legacies of colonialism and World War II occupation. Pakistan and India against each other over Kashmir. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC, members against Qatar because of differences over Iran and support for the Muslim Brotherhood. The African Union, AU, against Mali, South Sudan, and other African countries, and many others. While economic sanctions take many forms, such as trade, finance, and aid, and can be targeted against whole countries, key economic sectors, or designated individuals, all involve using economic relations for foreign policy and other political objectives. Their use goes way back in history, as with Athenian sanctions against Sparta in 432 BC, and Napoleon's 1808 to 1814 continental system. But it wasn't until the second half of the 20th century that their frequency started significantly increasing. From 1915 to 1940, there were only 11 sanctions cases, averaging out to well less than one case per year. During the Cold War, 1945 to 1990, there were 610 cases, a 13.5 annual average. From 1990 to 2005, this further increased to 802 cases, a 53.5 annual average. While data since then are less systematic, the examples cited suggest a continuing robust rate. With such frequency of use, you'd think sanctions were a surefire weapon, yet there is plenty of debate over their success rate. One study puts it at 22%, another at 34%, and one flat out sees sanctions as bringing to the coercion table little independent usefulness compared to military force. Even when they do impose some political pain, they can also inflict that civilian pain with humanitarian consequences so severe as to raise fundamental ethical questions. On the other hand, there is a view among some scholars that sanctions' success gets systematically underestimated by studies that accentuate the negative and downplay the positive aspects. I know from my own experience serving in the U.S. State Department and in other policy roles that policymakers often see sanctions as a weapon of choice. Even if all the conceptual and methodological problems are worked out and a consensual success rate reached, the question remains, measured against what? What percentage of success is needed for sanctions to be considered an effective strategy? In baseball, a batter who hits 300, that is, 3 successes out of 10 tries, is considered to have had an excellent year. In football, a quarterback needs a passing completion rate of more than 50% to have even a good season. In basketball, free throws need to be made 70 to 80% of the time. So, some initial puzzles. Why do sanctions get used? How to measure success? What key factors affect success? What lessons can policymakers derive for why, how, and when to wield sanctions? These and related questions are well suited for an Oxford University Press What Everyone Needs to Know book. The book is structured in 2 sections. Part 1 focuses on the academic literature and scholarly challenges involving major concepts, theoretical debates, and methodological issues. Chapter 1 defines core terminology of what the different types of sanctions are, who the key actors are, why sanctions are imposed in terms of the policy objectives being pursued, and how sanctions are supposed to achieve their objectives. Chapter 2 tackles the "do sanctions work" question. It goes into more detail on the various scorecards and probes methodological issues of what actually constitutes a sanctions case and what metrics best measure success. It then addresses ethical issues, taking humanitarian effects into account in assessments of success. Chapter 3 focuses on the explanatory side of when, how, and why sanctions do or do not succeed. Among the questions examined, is economic impact the key factor? Is a reciprocity strategy, sanctions and inducements together, most effective? Do multilateral sanctions work better than unilateral ones? Are democracies more vulnerable to sanctions, non-democracies less so? Are targeted smart sanctions, particularly financial ones, more effective than more general ones? Is the type of objective for which sanctions are being used the key factor? While these Part 1 chapters bring cases in illustratively, Part 2 provides case studies of major sanctions policy cases organized by major sanctions sender and analyzed within the Part 1 what, who, why, how framework. Chapter 4 provides historical perspective. It includes 7 cases, starting with the 432 BC Athenian sanctions against Sparta amid the Peloponnesian Wars, Napoleon's early 19th century continental system blockade against Britain, and the League of Nations 1935 to 1936 sanctions against Italy over its invasion of Ethiopia, Abyssinia. 4 are post-World War II, the 1956 Suez Crisis, U.S. sanctions against Britain, the UN sanctions against Rhodesia, 1966 to 1979, the Arab League and OPEC 1973 sanctions against the U.S. and Europe, and UN and U.S. sanctions against South Africa, 1977 to 1994. Chapter 5 focuses on the U.S. as the most frequent sanctions wielder. This was true during the Cold War and has been true since, the Biden administration included. Various aspects of the what, why, and how questions are addressed in the context of American domestic politics and overall foreign policy strategy. Cases include Iran, various sanctions against the Soviet Union and Russia, including those in 2022 related to Ukraine, various ones against China, North Korea, Venezuela, and counterterrorism. Chapter 6 examines China's use of sanctions. Once an ardent critic of U.S. and other sanctions as extensions of Western imperialism and violations of its sovereignty, over the past decade plus, China has been wielding its own sanctions. We first analyze its general pattern of use, both officially promulgated formal sanctions and informally cued ones. Case studies include Taiwan, elections, U.S. arms sales, France and Tibet, Norway and the 2010 Liu Xiaobo Nobel Peace Prize, South Korea THAAD missile defense, Australia anti-Chinese domestic politics, and the NBA and the Hong Kong democratization protests. Chapter 7 is on Soviet and Russian use of sanctions. 3 sender state cases are examined: Soviet sanctions against Tito's Yugoslavia, 1948 to 1955, Russia against other Commonwealth of Independent States in the 1990s, and Russian counter-sanctions against the U.S. and the EU over Ukraine from 2014 on. 3 other cases involve Soviet and Russian oil and natural gas pipelines to Western Europe, the early 1960s Friendship oil pipeline, the early 1980s Siberian natural gas pipeline, and the contemporary Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and debate over whether European energy dependence would give Moscow sanctions leverage. Chapter 8 addresses multilateral sanctions authorized by the UN Security Council and EU sanctions as an example of the role regional organizations play. UN sanctions show both the advantages and the problems for multilateral sanctions. Cases are the Iraq 1990s comprehensive sanctions that were part of the overall post-Gulf War strategy, and Liberia 1992 to 2016, and Côte d'Ivoire 2004 to 2016 targeted sanctions dealing with armed conflicts. The EU section focuses on the what, why, and how effective of its sanctions, and the mix of consensus and tensions with the U.S. The concluding section has 2 main objectives. It ties together the case evidence in Part 2 with the concepts and propositions laid out in Part 1 as contributions to the development of scholarly theory about economic sanctions, and it draws out insights and findings identifying key factors for sanctions efficacy as a working template applicable to policy strategizing going forward. Part 1. Scholarly Debates and Challenges. 1. Economic Sanctions: What, Who, Why, and How. This chapter sets out definitions of key terms and establishes an analytic framework of what are the different types of sanctions, who are the key actors, why are sanctions imposed in terms of the policy objectives being pursued, How are sanctions supposed to achieve their objectives? Working our way down the conceptual ladder, economic sanctions can be seen as a species of the genus economic power. In his classic National Power and the Structure of Foreign Trade, Albert Hirschman looks at how foreign trade in all its forms can be an economic source of national power. David Baldwin's concept of economic statecraft encompasses most any use of economic means by one state to influence another state or international institution in pursuit of objectives not strictly economic in nature. Weaponized interdependence, as developed recently by Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman, is the ability of states to use global economic networks to achieve geostrategic objectives. Focusing in more particularly on economic sanctions, my baseline definition is the actual or threatened denial of economic relations by one or more states, sender or senders, intended to influence the behavior of another state or non-state actors, target, on foreign policy and other political issues. While some scholars include sanctions used for trade wars and other economic objectives, in my view, the policy and political dynamics vary sufficiently based on whether core objectives are political or economic to warrant separate study and strategizing. What are the different types of sanctions? Sanctions can be of a number of different types, including trade, embargoes of exports to and boycotts of imports from target states, the most commonly used sanctions, finance, freezing assets held within the sender state's financial systems, limiting or banning commercial banking financial transactions, and limiting or banning investment in the target state. Foreign aid, limiting or terminating economic, military, and other government-to-government aid unless certain conditions are met. Travel, prohibiting travel by target state individuals to the sender states and restricting travel by its citizens to the target state. Sports, banning target state athletes from international sports such as the Olympics and FIFA football, soccer, and rugby World Cups. Cultural, banning artists and performers from the target state. They also can have different scopes. Comprehensive, seeking to prevent virtually all trade akin to economic warfare, as Queen Elizabeth I put it back in the 16th century with regard to Philip I of Spain, the stopping, hindrance, and impeaching of all commerce and traffic with him in his territories of Spain and Portugal will quickly, in all likelihood, give an end to these bloody, unnatural wars which disturb the general peace and quiet of all these parts of Christendom. Sectoral, aimed at key parts of the target's economy. Arms embargoes, of which there have been over 100, some multilateral by the UN and some by the US, EU, and others, are one example. Energy sanctions are another, some as oil producer export embargoes, OPEC 1973, and some by energy consumers, boycotting Iranian oil, blocking Soviet or Russian oil and natural gas pipelines. Targeted, often dubbed smart sanctions, stylized as the economic equivalent of precision-guided munitions, seeking to impose costs on designated high-value targets, individuals, businesses, non-state actors, other entities, while limiting collateral damage to the civilian population. The calculation is that such direct costs can push those targeted to cease their actions and or exert pressure on the regime for policy change. The U.S. Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons, SDN list, targets individuals, companies, and other entities acting for or on behalf of targeted countries, as well as terrorists and narcotics traffickers designated under programs that are not country-specific. The EU's Consolidated Financial Sanctions List and UN Security Council Consolidated List, while less extensive, have similar intent. Secondary, imposed by the sender state on third parties outside its own national jurisdiction to coerce their cooperation. The U.S. has been the lead invoker of secondary sanctions, claiming extraterritorial application of its laws to foreign subsidiaries of U.S.-based multinational corporations, making goods that the U.S. embargoes, but the host country does not. Foreign companies using U.S.-made parts or U.S.-licensed technology, and banks and companies anywhere in the world continuing to do business with the target through dollar-denominated transactions. Clashes between American assertions of extraterritorial reach and European defense of sovereignty have sparked tensions in such cases as Iran sanctions and Soviet or Russian pipelines. Another distinction is between formal and informal sanctions. Formal sanctions are ones explicitly mandated by a government or an international institution. In the U.S., these may be by congressional legislation or by presidential executive order. For the UN, Security Council action is required. Informal sanctions are ones that government authorities cue businesses and individuals within their countries to impose without officially promulgating them. China is the main practitioner of informal cued sanctions, as with consumer boycotts of the South Korean company Lotte over the 2016 to 2017 deployment of a U.S. THAAD anti-missile system, and fanning social media outrage against the National Basketball Association for one of its officials having tweeted support for the 2019 Hong Kong protesters. Who are the key actors? Here I work with a threefold categorization: sender, target, third parties, with distinctions within each. Sender. Unilateral sanctions are those imposed exclusively or primarily by a single country. The U.S. has long been the most frequent unilateral sanctions sender, in 68% of cases in one study, 52% in another. Multilateral sanctions can have various degrees of multi. Coalitional sanctions are ones on which an alliance or other group of states act collectively. For example, Cold War sanctions imposed by COCOM, Consultative Group Coordinating Committee, comprising NATO plus Japan and Australia, on military-related exports to the Soviet Union and its allies. Sanctions may also be through regional organizations, for example, EU, African Union, Organization of American States. Fully multilateral sanctions are ones imposed by the UN Security Council, of which there have been over 40 cases. In its day, the League of Nations had 4 cases. Target. Sanctions typically are targeted at a particular country or countries. In addition, the U.S. SDN list and European and UN counterparts, as noted, include sanctions singling out particular individuals, businesses, and other entities within target countries, as well as terrorist groups, for example, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and criminal organizations, for example, the Mexican drug ring Zetas, Eastern European criminal ring Brothers Circle. Third parties. A country menaced with an interruption of trade with a given country has the alternative of diverting trade to a third country, is how Hirschman captures the role played by third parties and the problem posed for senders and opportunity for targets. Third parties may be of 4 types: economically motivated by trade with the target, politically motivated as rival of the sender, neighboring states with porous borders, and non-state actors reaping profits from sanctions busting. Why are sanctions imposed in terms of the policy objectives pursued? Doing some synthesizing and aggregating from other studies, I distinguish between primary and secondary objectives and identify 3 subtypes of each. Primary objectives seek to use sanctions to change a target's objectionable policy in three ways. Limit military capabilities. Prevent a target from aggression by denying or at least reducing its military capabilities. For example, arms embargoes, Iran and North Korea nuclear non-proliferation sanctions, technology export controls against Russia during its 2022 Ukraine war. Foreign policy restraint. Deter or compel change in aggressive or otherwise threatening foreign policies. For example, UN 1990 to 1991 sanctions against Iraq over Kuwait invasion, 1980 U.S. sanctions against Soviet Union over Afghanistan, 2016 to 2017 China sanctions against South Korea over THAAD missile deployment, 2014 and 2022 sanctions against Russia over Ukraine. Domestic political change. Promote democratic elections and protect human rights, as with EU and US against various authoritarian regimes, and in their most extensive form, incite regime change, Cuba, Venezuela. Secondary objectives are efforts to signal resolve beyond the immediate issue of target policy change in one or more of the following ways. Target deterrence, deter further objectionable action by the target even if immediate policy change is not compelled. Third-party deterrence, deter other international actors from taking action comparable to what the target did. Symbolic action, affirm core international norms and national values when atrocities are committed, human rights violated, or democracy repressed. One can find various combinations of these secondary objectives in almost every case. How are sanctions supposed to achieve their objectives? Initial power balance factors like trade dominance, dependence, and relative military strength are useful starting points, but whether sanctions achieve their objectives depends on the strategic interaction of sender, target, and third parties, each playing out its strategies. Sender strategy. What is the overall strategy of which sanctions are a part? Sanctions are rarely the only instrument by which a sender seeks to achieve its objectives. An ambassador may be recalled, offers made to negotiate, other diplomatic initiatives taken. Military force may be threatened or used. Covert operations may be launched. In none of the cases that follow were sanctions the only action the U.S., China, Russia, or other sender states took, nor for the UN, whose sanctions were almost always accompanied by diplomacy and mediation, and often by peacekeeping. How does the sender manage its domestic politics? What is the mix of sanctions support and opposition at home? Even if there is little chance of achieving primary or secondary objectives, there may be domestic political benefits in avoiding "don't just stand there, do something" criticism. British political opposition leader David Lloyd George, hoping to make the Conservative Party government's inaction over Mussolini's 1935 Abyssinia, Ethiopia invasion an issue in the upcoming election, lamented that the League of Nations sanctions came too late to save Abyssinia from subjugation by Italy, but they are just in the nick of time to save the British government. A study using data from U.S. presidential approval ratings shows playing to the home crowd political benefits, even when sanctions were not expected to succeed. In some cases, the politics are directed at special interest constituencies, for example, Cuban Americans. On the other hand, sanctions can backfire politically, the classic case being the 1980 Soviet grain embargo as a factor in President Jimmy Carter's re-election loss to Ronald Reagan. Non-democracies also can have their own domestic politics to manage if the imposition of sanctions significantly damages the interests of elites key to the regime's grip on power, as we'll see more in Chapter 3. Target counter-strategy. even when the senders have major economic advantages.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?